Hello and welcome to Writers and Books Visiting Authors series. This event is a partnership with Livonia Public Library. My name is Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programming for people of all ages, all currently available online. Our theme for 2021 is taking care. We're celebrating different ways we can take care of ourselves and take care of others this year. You can check out our upcoming schedule at wab.org. Please say hello in the chat and let us know you're there. Feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function. Books are available through our bookstore, Ampersand Books. I'll put the link in the chat. We're so happy to have Lucy Antek Johnson with us today. First, we'll hear from her, and then we'll have some time to talk and take questions. Samuel Antec, a first violinist with the NBC Symphony Orchestra, captured the 17 years he performed under the baton of the legendary Arturo Toscanini in the memoir, This Was Toscanini, published in 1963. Antec shared his keen observations of Toscanini's singular approach to musical creativity, his unpredictable moods, his passions, and his relentless demands on himself and his musicians, and his unwavering dedication to faithfully interpreting composers' works. Antec's daughter, Lucy Antek Johnson, brings this stellar work back into print with a new expanded edition, This Was Toscanini, the Maestro, My Father and Me, making Toscanini's legacy available to new generations of students, musicians, music historians, and classical music fans. Samuel Antec began his violin studies in Chicago and became a protege of Leopold Auer. He won a fellowship to attend the Juilliard Foundation and played solo concerts extensively. In 1937, Mr. Antec was selected to become a first violinist for the NBC Symphony, an orchestra created by RCA for the legendary conductor Arturo Toscanini. He was a member of the orchestra from 1937 to 1954 and also launched his own career as a conductor. This Was Toscanini was published posthumously. Lucy Antek Johnson, Samuel Antec's daughter, was born and raised in New York City. After studying music, fine art, and ballet, she was drawn into the world of television production and spent her entire career in the entertainment industry. When she moved to Los Angeles in 1978, she produced movies for television, then joined NBC as a network executive. She served as Senior Vice President of Daytime and Children's Programs for CBS, a position she held for 14 years. Lucy, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Dan, and to share this lovely day with all of you folks. Thank you very much. Today, I'm going to share some highlights from the new book that Dan so beautifully described, as well as show some photos along the way. Dan, we can show the first one, please. Here it is. That's the cover of my new book. And now I'm going to start with a little story so we can go to the next picture. For as far back as I can remember, Arturo Toscanini's autographed picture sat atop our Steinway piano in my family's New York City apartment. And to this day, many decades later, it still occupies a place of honor on the same piano right over there, now in my Connecticut living room. And although I wasn't even born when the NBC Symphony was formed, and I only have a dim memory of seeing the Maestro across a crowded rehearsal room, I was clutching my mother's hand and trying to be as quiet as a mouse, Arturo Toscanini was a central figure in our home. Next, please. My father, as Dan said, my father, Samuel Antec, was only 29 when he, already a recognized violin virtuoso, was handpicked to be a first violinist with the new NBC Symphony. It was an orchestra specially created for Toscanini, who was often referred to as the greatest musician of the 20th century. He had attained a pinnacle of honor and success matched by few musicians of any era. By today's standards, we'd say he's a rock star. He really, really was through his whole life. And today, it's my pleasure. You can change the picture, please. Next picture. Okay. Next picture. Anyway, today it is my pleasure to share my labor of love with you. This was Toscanini, the Maestro, my father and me, which is partly my father's acclaimed memoir, originally published years ago, in which he shares insights and observations about his 17 years playing under Toscanini's legendary baton. But also, as the subtitle suggests, in this new and expanded edition, I'm the Me. I share my own recollections about my mom, my dad, his illustrious career as a violinist and conductor, and the impact that the Maestro had on our family during such a memorable time in classical music history. In essence, it's a memoir wrapped in a memoir. So why now did I do this? You might be thinking, well, in 2017, it was the 150th anniversary of Toscanini's birth. And at that point, many articles and books were being printed about Toscanini and his legacy. And the book that stood out for me was Harvey Sachs' celebrated new biography called Toscanini, Musician of Conscience. And what particularly moved me was that Harvey had quoted passages from my father's original memoir. Well, I was absolutely thrilled and proud to see Dad's elegant writing about the Maestro in print once again. So it inspired me to reread his book. It had been sitting in my living room for years, but I hadn't sat down and really read it in many, many years. And once I reread it again, I was absolutely convinced that it deserved a new life. It was time to introduce his words to new generations of musicians. I also knew I wanted to include material about our family and bring my father more center stage. His story deserved to be told as well. So off I went, spending hours in my dad's archives at the New York Public Library at Lincoln Center, and delving into old boxes in my basement marked Sam or Toscanini, filled with letters and photos and recordings. This quickly became a deeply, deeply emotional journey. Tragically, my father had died very young, just as he was achieving his own recognition as a conductor. He was only 49, I was only 12, and overnight our little family was upended. The music world might have lost a rising star, but I had lost my hero. So in my research, when I was reading his handwritten notes or hearing his voice on recordings or watching him playing on old TV broadcasts on YouTube, or holding a favorite photo once again, it was a profound impact on me. It was a very sweet sadness. I don't know if we're still doing pictures, but the number 5 would be the time to do this, Dan. This Was Toscanini is not a biography. It's an intimate, behind the scenes and highly illuminating portrait of the Maestro, his music, and his creative process, told from the unique perspective of a musician lucky enough to play under Toscanini's baton in over hundreds of rehearsals and concerts and innumerable recording sessions. And my father brings alive the work that made those concerts possible. He takes us right inside the 2 decades of performances, and we feel as if we're sitting among the players of the orchestra, experiencing firsthand as they experienced what inspired the Maestro's dynamic approach to a score, his conducting style, and what triggered his explosive passions. So it's as though we've been invited into a masterclass with an artistic genius. And Riccardo Muti, Maestro Muti, who now conducts the Chicago Symphony, who's a renowned conductor today, has said the following about Toscanini, quote, Toscanini was a revolutionary of musical interpretation. He placed the performer totally at the service of the composer in sacred respect for and fidelity to the written text, unquote. Might be interesting to note that Toscanini benefited throughout his career from his photographic memory. All through the years, he had memorized 120 operas, and he knew 400 symphonic works by heart. We'd be up to number 6, Dan. Yet he always referred, thank you. Yet he always referred to his score during rehearsals and always encouraged his players not to memorize the music. His credo was, play what is written, look to the score. Yeah, no, we'll stay on 6. Yes, thank you. Now we can. So conducting is infinitely more than just keeping time and cueing an entrance of a player. It's the fine art and genius of interpreting a score. And just as an actor interprets a role by a playwright or a dancer interprets a choreographer's work, so does a conductor shape the musical performance of a composer. How loud is forte? How soft is pianissimo? How many beats to build the crescendo? But obviously conductors can't create on their own. A conductor needs a composer, musicians, and of course instruments. And the orchestra was Toscanini's instrument. Next picture, if we can do that. Thank you. For those who need a refresher or just might not know much about Toscanini's earlier life, which is quite unusual, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about his background. He was born into a working class family in Parma in 1867. And just to put it in a little perspective, Brahms was 35 at the time. So he was born when Brahms was pretty young. At 18, Toscanini graduated from the Parma Conservatory as an accomplished cellist. And at 19, only 19, he became principal cellist and assistant chorus master for an Italian opera company touring Brazil. But it was in Brazil that a historic twist of fate changed the course of the Maestro's future and the classical music history, of course. Right at the start, the tour conductor abruptly resigned, and Toscanini, with his photographic memory, and he knew all the operas in the repertoire, was thrust upon the stage to take over. And once he held the baton and took command, he never looked back. So in his 20s, he revolutionized the production and performance of opera throughout Italy. And by 30, he was principal conductor at La Scala, conducting the Italian premieres of operas that are still the foundation of repertoires today, La Bohème, Turandot, Pagliacci. So his music not only made headlines, but his political beliefs made headlines as well. His single-minded and almost stubborn personality not only reflected his devotion to music, but gave him the strength to stand up to Mussolini and Hitler. Toscanini refused to perform in Germany once Hitler came to power, and years earlier in Italy, with the rise of fascism, he refused to play the fascist party hymn, Giovinezza, which Mussolini had required be played at all public events. So of course, there were consequences. In 1931 in Bologna, after one performance, where once again Toscanini did not play the party anthem, he and his wife were brutally attacked and beaten by a fascist mob outside the theater, all because of his unpatriotic, that's in quotes, defiance of Il Duce. From then on, Toscanini vowed not to play in Italy until the fascist regime fell. And even though he was regarded as a national treasure in Italy, his fame and his status protected him only up to a point. He was kept under strict surveillance. They tapped his phones. They took away his passports for times, even threatened imprisonment. And I'm sure Mussolini really wanted him to keep quiet, but he wouldn't. He remained vocal in his democratic beliefs and kept performing throughout Europe, Israel, and the United States, but not Italy. And just as life for him in Milan was becoming more challenging, in 1936, David Sarnoff, the RCA chairman of the board, RCA owned the NBC network, he made a dramatic commitment to create a new orchestra. And when Toscanini agreed to sign on as conductor, Sarnoff knew it would be the jewel in the crown of the NBC schedule, as well as for their recording division. In the following year, at age 70, when most people are thinking of retiring, Toscanini made a life-changing choice. He left his beloved Italy with his family, and they moved to the United States, and he inaugurated the NBC Symphony. The concerts were broadcast live from Studio 8H in the NBC studios on Saturday nights. I was too young to attend, but I listened from home every week. Can we have the next picture? The program? Okay, thank you. This is the program of the first concert And the debut concert was performed on Christmas night, 1937. And by the way, it's interesting to note, this is printed on silk. And almost all the programs throughout the years for the concerts, because they were live broadcasts, were printed either on silk or cardboard or cork, anything that would not make a noise from the audience for the live broadcasts. And just to give you an idea of how intensely popular Toscanini was, there were 1,400 available seats for that first concert, but there were 23,000 requests for tickets. So what was that first meeting between the orchestra and Toscanini really like? And on that memorable day, the musicians, they were sitting very nervous. They sat rigid, waiting for him to appear. They were about to begin their first rehearsal for their premiere performance under the baton of one of the most famous men in the world. They were about to make history, no pressure. And when Toscanini walked in and crossed to the podium, the musicians spontaneously all stood in unison. They had been warned in advance not to make any vocal acknowledgement. He nodded to the assembled players for them to sit, and without any formal greeting called out, "Brahms," and they dove into the music. Next picture, please. Number 9. Thanks. I'm going to quote a little from my dad's writing about that afternoon. Quote, "In one smashing stroke, the baton came down, a vibrant sound gushed forth. Was this the same music we had been practicing so assiduously for days? With what fierce new joy we played. So, the maestro bellowed, cantare, sostenere, sing, sustain, Toscanini's battle cry. This was the first time these words were flung at us, and for 17 years, we lived by them," unquote. And in the book, my father shares detailed accounts of how grueling some of the rehearsals over the years could be. They might spend a half an hour on a particular string instrument, or in one instance, they played the opening bars of Beethoven's Sixth over and over and over until the music on the page, the sound from the players, and what Toscanini heard in his head all meshed perfectly. Next picture, please. Number 10. Toscanini's plaintive cry, "Play with your hearts, not your instruments." But that process could be dramatic and as congenial and as social as he could be off stage. In rehearsals, he was sometimes tyrannical and well known for his artistic temperament. And he was famous, or maybe I should say infamous, for his use of Italian curses if a particular sequence wasn't meeting his exacting standards, standards that he had set for himself. Next picture. Vergogna, shame, was one of his favorites, also the most tame of the phrases. And un pasticcio, it's a mess, was another favorite. But my father would often bring home some more earthy curses at the end of a tough rehearsal day. And as my father said, there were two Toscaninis, the peasant at rehearsals and the aristocrat at concerts. So sometimes the simplest little error would set off these outbursts, a note too loud, a crescendo too soon, anything was enough to set off the fuse. And my father writes about many of those most memorable flare-ups. But can we see the next picture? Thanks. I'm going to quote again about one of those things. Quote, "One of his most violent displays of temper concerned nothing more than 2 grace notes that had not been articulated in Wagner's Tannhäuser Overture, a momentous crime in Toscanini's eyes. He was known to break his baton, rip up a score, tear up his jacket, or stomp off in disgust. Dramatic, stagey, theatrical, yes. But every movement of his baton, every motion of his hands, every burst of rage served music, and the musicians loved him for it. My father believed that as tough as the maestro was on them, they became better musicians because of it. And as the maestro is known to say, here's another little Italian phrase, any asino can conduct, but to make music is difficile." We can change the picture. Next. Okay, now I'd like to give you a little background about my father, who was Samuel Antec. He reveals only a little about himself in the memoir. And so in my new essays, I took the opportunity to show a more complete picture of him and his musical career. And as Dan told you in the introduction, he grew up in Chicago, was recognized as a prodigy at a very young age, and his parents scraped together the money to send him to the best teachers in Chicago. But in his late teens, he moved to New York to study with Leopold Auer, who was a very famed teacher in the day, and got a fellowship to Juilliard, and then had his debut at Town Hall. But it was only a few months later that he was invited into the elite group of musicians hired to be in the original NBC Symphony. But he had always had a dream to conduct. And he had conducted small ensembles, and similar to the Maestro's Twist of Fate story in Brazil, or like a story out of a Hollywood movie, Dad got his first real chance on a radio show when during a rehearsal for his violin solo, the conductor became ill, and they asked my father to take over. And then Dad took over the whole series for the next couple of years. So from that point on, he knew he wanted to pursue his goal more seriously. He really wanted to lead a major orchestra. Next picture, please. Thank you. His dream came true. And at the age of 39, with the support and encouragement of Toscanini, and without having to give up his seat with NBC, he was named conductor and musical director of the New Jersey Symphony Orchestra. And he held both positions for many, many years. And in the book, I illustrate more fully the lasting impact that my father had on that symphony. But to my young eyes at the time, his crowning achievements were the interactive children's concerts, which he innovated in 1950, a few years before Leonard Bernstein. And each weekend it was a sellout event attracting kids from all over New Jersey. And sometimes I would sit in the audience, but then I would watch from the wings, beaming with "That's my daddy" pride. Dad's reputation grew rapidly, and soon he was guest conducting major orchestras around the country. And when Arturo Toscanini invited my father to guest conduct the NBC Symphony, Dad's future was really sealed. And I used to love sitting next to him at the piano at home when he was preparing for an upcoming concert, probably in New Jersey. And I'd watch him unfold the mysterious and magical sheets of musical notepaper. He'd play a chord, make a notation, play another chord, make another notation. It was my first introduction to how complex that process was. Next picture. Thanks. This Was Toscanini includes much more about what it was like to grow up with such a dynamic father, but it also covers many other dimensions of the maestro's personality and professional story, not just what he was like in a rehearsal hall. In the Touring with Toscanini section, my father tells of their triumphant cross-country tour in 1950. And I, after discovering my mother's journals and photos detailing the orchestra's 1940 wartime South American tour, described what their fears were like on the high seas as they sailed into Nazi territory, and how Toscanini walked around the deck fingering a crucifix, praying for the Allies. Obviously, he wouldn't see Italy again for many years. There's a fascinating chapter on the painstaking process of the NBC Symphony recording sessions, and one of my favorite chapters is The Visit, where my father shares his rare and memorable afternoon visiting with Toscanini in his home, and they indulged in lengthy conversations about composers, specifically Verdi, who was a friend of the maestro. He had played cello for him, but he had also conducted many of his operas. That afternoon was so special, and I like to say it was my father's own private masterclass. And the final chapter, Toscanini conducts Oberon, is a feast for musicians. It's a bar-by-bar journey of Maestro's unique interpretation of Weber's Oberon Overture. It's a good read, whether you're a pro or just an enthusiast. So sadly, Dad passed away before he could write the final chapter of the book. Would it have been a quick wrap-up, a lengthy essay? We'll never know. However, in my research, delving through all those boxes, I found handwritten notes, his handwritten notes, that to me indicate what might have been his last chapter, because he entitled them The Final Concert. Next picture. And the story goes that during what was planned to be the symphony's final concert of the season in April 1954, Toscanini faltered in the middle of the concert. His hands dropped, and the orchestra didn't know what to do. The studio audience was completely baffled. The engineers in the recording room didn't know what to do either, so they quickly put on another concert that had been recorded, which totally confused the home audience. And it was quite a few minutes, quite a few harrowing minutes passed until Toscanini regained his composure and was able to complete the program, but he wasn't his usual powerful self. And I'll read to you just a few lines from my father's handwritten notes that describe that moment. Quote, as our beloved 87-year-old Maestro left the stage dazed and tottering, he pushed past me and the baton dropped from his hand. It was to be the last of his conducting in public, unquote. Toscanini died a few years later in 1957, shortly before his 90th, which in a strange way was almost exactly a year to the day that my father died before his 50th. So my mother was determined to publish his existing manuscript, and she joined forces with photographer Robert Hupka, who had taken thousands of candid photographs, the ones you've seen today, over many years without the Maestro's knowledge. It was all in long lenses, and these portraits have become iconic photos throughout the world. And they're in the book as well, of course. When the first edition of my father's memoir was published posthumously in 1963, New York Times critic Edward Downes stated, quote, this book will probably remain the most enduring and endearing monument to the art of Arturo Toscanini, unquote. And it has. To this day, it remains the only full-length narrative from a musician's perspective about what Toscanini's creative process was and what it felt like to work with and be mentored by this unique and gifted artist. Next picture. Aha, guess who? So during this journey of writing and compiling this book, I not only was able to renew a long overdue relationship with my father, but I got to enjoy knowing him. And this time through the eyes of an adult rather than just an adoring young daughter. Next picture. Yeah, this is my favorite. This is when he's coming off stage after a concert and he's glowing. Well, he's glowing from the effort, but also with joy. And that's what I respond to, is the joy. So I wanted to share that with you. Next picture, please. Yeah, this is the two of them. During this journey, I also developed a big soft spot for the Maestro. He was no longer just an imposing figure staring down from our piano top. This irascible, musically brilliant, politically courageous, and shy, yes, he was shy, force of nature was someone I would have loved to have known. And so in closing, I hope I've given you a taste of this new edition. We can turn to the cover now again, thanks. This was Toscanini, the Maestro, my father and me, which is my loving tribute to two musicians whose paths fortuitously crossed and whose individual gifts inspired each of them in their lifelong quest to make beautiful music. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was great. I want to apologize for the technical difficulties with some of the photos, but I'm glad we got it up and running again. If anyone from the audience has questions, we have some time to get to them. Meanwhile, I have some questions.
Sure.
It's such an interesting project, reissuing your father's book, because you get perspective on Toscanini, but also on your father. I'm wondering what was involved in reissuing this book, and if there was anything that really surprised you in bringing it back together.
Oh, that's very interesting. Well, as I said in my talk, once I reread the original book, I absolutely knew, I was convinced not only was the art, Toscanini's art, timeless, but my father's words were timeless. So I've never done this before. I come from show business. I don't know from publishing, but I figured first you got to start with the product, right? You have to write something. And at first I thought I would just write an introductory page to introduce his manuscript once again. And then after doing some research, I realized there was so much more to say. And there was so much joy in reconnecting with my father, and his story deserved more attention, and our family life deserved more attention, that I then decided I would make an introduction to each of his original chapters which would accomplish a number of things, not just his growth as a musician, stories, my memories of our family together, but also to bring the reader into the next chapter. So I very carefully fashioned them and shaped them to lead you to what he was going to write next. I worked with an editor who helped me shape this and who put this in the third one, not the fourth one, and things like that. And we came up with a manuscript. And then I said, now what do I do? I kind of always figured I would self-publish. I had to learn really what that meant. And it's not that I gave up on mainstream publishing, but I could have spent the next 5 years chasing it. And I didn't want to do that. Also, I knew this was not something, or I assumed this was not something that was, listen, I'm not Daniel Silva, and I'm not, writing, the next thriller. I understood this was for a very niche audience. And so I wanted it to be the classiest and the most beautiful production I could get. And I was lucky through my attorney to meet an agent who then introduced me to the publishers, who are hybrid publishers, which, if you don't know what that means in the audience, they provide everything that a mainstream publisher provides: design, editing, sales, all the support, but you, the author, contribute to the cost of it. So it's self-publishing, but with a real support system and with a real structure. And I have to tell you, I am so thrilled with the result of this book and what it looks like. It's on beautiful paper. It's beautifully designed. It's beautifully bound. And here we are. I mean, lucky me. What surprised me, I think what surprised me the most was my writing. I've been studying memoir for years. I've been working in workshops for years, never expecting to publish anything. That wasn't my goal. But what I did learn was how to take a memory and turn it into a story with a beginning, middle, and end. And my concern was that my writing level wouldn't be up to my father's writing level, because his writing is beautiful. And people have said his writing is looks and reads as accomplished as he was a musician. So I thought, oh my goodness, I got to compete with that. Well, I think I did pretty well. And reviews have said, and other interviewers have said that the two, the intros and his text, blend so beautifully. So I think that was the biggest surprise to me.
Yeah, and I'll say the link to buy the book is in the chat. It's a beautiful book. There are beautiful pictures in it. Yeah, please go purchase it. As you said, your father died when you were pretty young, and you've also said that he didn't reveal too much about himself in the book. But I'm wondering if you, having revisited the book so many years later, if there was anything you found out about him that
in his writing or in my research? Because
either one. Yeah, I guess the whole process.
Well, let me just start with my research, which really meant I was looking at material that I had seen before, because I grew up with it and I had put it in those boxes. But it's so different when you're looking at something when you have a mission. The same piece of paper has a totally different meaning. Same letters have a different meaning. So I reread everything and felt his personality and was awakened to and reunited with, my goodness, what a talented guy he was, and how sad that his life was cut so short. So that's the poignant part in the research. In the writing, I think, as I said before, what struck me was really how good a writer he was and how he brings to life each of these moments and the work that it must have taken. Because I know he wrote this over a few years. I remember him writing in the house. I remember my mother typing up every word he wrote. I remember trying to proofread. They wanted to bring me into the act a little bit. So I can't say it surprised me, because it's not like I didn't know he was good, but it really hit home. God, he nailed that. He really, and it was such respect for the maestro, but also a real mirror to the maestro. And the maestro had seen some of this writing and had really been very pleased, may I add.
Hmm. Toscanini, he's such a legendary figure. Like even people not familiar with classical music will know his name and the kind of image of a conductor. It's kind of in his image. Having read your dad's account of it, and also knowing, what do you think accounts for his influence and his appeal?
Well, he was highly charismatic. He was not a cartoon character like you think of, in movies of these almost cartoonish characters, the temperamental maestro. He really wasn't. He was beautiful face, very imposing figure, but it was the music, the music, the music. I mean, all around the world, tens of thousands of people lined up for tickets for his concerts. He never liked to read about himself. He didn't even like to look at pictures of himself. So he was not bombastic or ego-driven. The music is what drove him. And I think what really set it off was his work in opera in Italy in the early part of the 20th century, the latter part of the 19th century, because he revolutionized opera. So he already, while he was in his 30s, had a major reputation. And once he was conducting around the world, not just opera, but symphonic pieces, he kept that reputation kept doubling and tripling because he really was that special. His interpretations did sound different and better, I might add, but did sound different than other interpretations. And even from his 70th year to his 87th, he was still considered the top. George Zell, who was the conductor of the Cleveland Symphony, has said it was before Toscanini and after Toscanini. So he really set a bar. And there's a lot to learn from him if you're a student of music. He's not passé. What he had to offer is not old-fashioned. It still resonates. It's still good music. It's still great art. So maybe that answers.
What do you think was your father's, why did he want to write that book? His impetus behind it?
It had started with when my father started conducting, and he was playing for the NBC Symphony. So he was really doing two different functions and was gaining reputation in both and attention in both. And also, let's face it, he was a very handsome man, and he too was very charismatic. He was commissioned to write an article for the Saturday Review, which was a magazine at the time, about what is it like to play with the maestro. Now you have to understand, maestro, it's like saying, what is it like to be with Paul McCartney? I mean, I don't know how to put it in today's words. He was so famous that people wanted to know, what is it really like? Is he really this? Is he really that? There was so much curiosity about him. So my father was commissioned to write an article, which he did, called Playing with the Maestro, and it appeared in 1950 in the Saturday Review, and it took off. And the publisher came to him and said, would you like to expand this into a book? And my father said, well, I'll try. I have a lot more I could say. And that's what really started this. He wrote many articles for the New York Times and for other periodicals throughout his career, but this became the focal point. So it started with a commission.
And you pointed out the parallels between Toscanini's career and your father's, how they got
started.
Yeah, in conducting.
Right.
I'm curious if your father's how he was a conductor, if that was similar to Toscanini.
I think I would believe, and it's a very interesting question, because I thought about that, and I thought, will I find evidence of that? Well, I didn't find literal evidence of him saying, yes, I did what the maestro said. there was no doubt my dad had his own style, but he had watched the best. He'd learned from the best. And when he went on that visit that I mentioned, when he goes to his home, it was for the reason of getting advice from the maestro about, my father was about to conduct Verdi's Requiem for the New Jersey Symphony. And he went to the maestro saying, do you have any advice? Because this is the first time my father was conducting it. And the maestro said, come on over and we'll talk. I mean, it was that kind of thing. And when he did go over, they really spent 3 hours almost talking about everything but. They talked about Verdi, they talked about other composers, they talked about interpreting scores. And finally, when my father said, but Maestro, do you have anything you want to share? And the Maestro said, you know how to do it. You've done it with me so many times. You've listened. You're okay. You can do this. Do you have enough people in the chorus? Yes. Do you have enough musicians? Yes. You're going to be great. So that was the extent of the advice or the mentoring.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
that would be very hard.
It was by example more than direct advice.
That's very interesting. I think this will have to be our last question, unless we get any from the audience. But I'm wondering if you have a favorite recording of either Toscanini's or your father's.
Well, my father never recorded with the New Jersey Symphony. So all the recordings, which by the way are available on Amazon or YouTube if you want to see videos, all the NBC Symphony recordings. I have two favorites. One, and I really advise anyone to look at it, is called Hymn of Nations by Verdi. And it's a celebratory concert that Toscanini put together, and it was filmed, professionally filmed. Once the fascist regime fell, Toscanini said, I've got to celebrate the Allies here. I can't wait, you know. And he put together this beautiful, beautiful concert with Jan Pierce and the Westminster Chorus and musicians. And they're playing all the anthems from all the Allied countries, as well as Verdi's work, and it ends with the Star Spangled Banner. I get teary just talking about it. And at the start of it, all the musicians playing stand in honor of their own country. Well, to me, it's just a great recording. And the other one that I just always had a fondness for was Mendelssohn's, it's called the Italian Symphony. I'm not quite sure what number or opus it is, but it's the Italian Symphony. And as a kid, I always loved it, and I still do love listening to it. So those are my two.
Thank you so much. This was great talking to you.
Thank you, Dan.
I want to say, yeah, please purchase the book. The link is in the chat. I want to mention, go to Lucy's website, thiswastoscanini.com. I want to thank Livonia Public Library. I want to thank our funders. I'll say a video of this and all our readings will be on our website, wab.org. You can check that out within a week or so. And as well as check out our upcoming readings as well. So I want to thank everyone for coming, and have a great weekend.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye. I'm leaving now.